G'day everyone, and welcome back to Scripture with Simon, the channel where we open up the Bible to show you what's going on. Now, in the last few episodes, we've been studying the book of Revelation to try and unpick what it's got to tell us about the future and the present, as it turns out. We've seen John caught up into the sky to receive a revelation from God, and now he writes what he has seen in this book so that others may learn from his experience. Well, today we're going to uncover the secret of the beast that comes out of the land, the third member of the unholy Trinity, and we're going to talk about the true meaning of the mark of the beast. Stay with me. Then I saw another beast arising out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. It also causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on their right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now let's go back and retrace some of the ground we've covered, because it all adds up in this episode. So in chapter 11, we saw two witnesses, and these two witnesses could command fire down from heaven. They were prophetic type figures, but they were also messianic in a sense. We mentioned in the Jewish tradition, there's this dual Messiah type figure or figures. One of them is like Joshua, the high priestly person who has this spiritual component, and the other is like Zerubbabel, who has this governor type component to their role. And these two figures fulfill that messianic role, and so that's why we had two witnesses in chapter 11, and they could command fire down from the sky and perform all these signs before the people. Well, today we're going to meet the second beast that comes out of the land, who fulfills a similar role to them. Just like the two witnesses, this figure can command fire out of the sky. This beast that comes not out of the sea but out of the land performs similar signs to these two witnesses. In fact, it reminds us of Jannes and Jambres in the book of Exodus, who are the people in Pharaoh's court. They're like magic men, and they imitate the signs of Moses during that whole conflict between Pharaoh, Moses, and his magicians. Moses will turn his staff into a snake and pick it up again, and the magicians do exactly the same thing. And we might see a similar idea here in the book of Revelation. This second beast that comes from the land imitates the magic signs produced by the two witnesses, and that shows and sets up a conflict between these people. Now, what you'll also notice about this beast is that it has horns like a lamb. Why is that significant? Well, because we learnt and we met about the lamb who was slain in chapter 5, who receives and shares honor with him who sits on the throne. Only the Lamb, you remember, was worthy to open the seals. Only the Lamb had authority to do so, so that we are now receiving this whole revelation being unfolded. The fact that these people look like a lamb tells us that they're like a double to this lamb who was slain also. They're on the other team. They're a rival, a combatant of this person, if you like. And that's not a surprise, because we see that this second beast that comes from the land receives his power and authority from the first beast. So thus forming this unholy trinity, if you like. In chapter 12, we met the dragon who attempted to attack the woman and the Messiah who she bore. So that's the first member of the Trinity, the dragon that represents the chaotic water monster who represents evil and destruction, the devil and Satan. And this first dragon inspires the second member of the unholy Trinity, the beast that comes out of the water. And that beast then is given power and authority by the dragon. And today we meet the third member of this unholy Trinity who receives power and authority from the first beast. And what does this person do? Well, like the two witnesses, it also creates, or fulfills, I should say, a prophetic type role. This second beast that comes from the earth points to the first beast, and he causes the whole world to follow after the beast. He is like a signpost, seducing people and encouraging them to follow after the beast. Now, what does that mean? What does this point towards? Well, the first beast, we said, represents empire. It represents kings who are seduced by the dragon, who follow after riches, power and authority. And that causes them to commit war and violence on the earth. And this second beast now encourages the people of the earth to follow, to do whatever this first beast says, to go to war, to fight one another, to create violence on the earth. That's the role of this second beast, is to convince people to do that. And they are like an antichrist type figure. As I mentioned, they're the enemy, the opposite to the lamb, a double, if you like, trying to imitate this whole role of the lamb and the witnesses, that messianic role on the earth. So how do they do that? What does this represent? Well, I think this creature represents the desire that people have, which draws them into conflict with one another. The first beast wants them to go to war and to fight one another, and this second beast encourages them and seduces them into doing so. So what this represents is desire, really, our own desire for the things that the first beast is chasing after, like riches, honor, power, or it may even be as simple as survival, trying to preserve one's own life. That might be what this second beast represents, but for whatever reason, it represents the motivations of the people on the earth, the desires which seduce them into following after the beast and acquiescing to his request to fight against the armies of other nations, to propagate and destroy as violence sweeps across the earth. And notice there's this great idol, this statue of the first beast that must be worshipped, otherwise people will be killed. What does that remind us of? Well, it reminds us of the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar is in there. Nebuchadnezzar commands Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to worship the idol. They refuse and they're thrown into the furnace, but they survive. But anyway, this whole idea of having to bow down and worship the image of the beast reminds us of people having to bow down and worship the image of Nebuchadnezzar under the pain of death. Again, we're seeing this is about empire and kings forcing their will on the people and terrorizing them so that they will fall in line with their murderous regime. Now, the false prophet does another sign. He makes the idol talk. He brings it to life, or at least it appears to come to life, to impress all of the people. Why is this important? Well, you might remember that earlier on, when the sixth trumpet was blown, there was all these earthquakes and disasters going on in the earth, but we're told that the people did not stop worshipping their idols, which can neither hear nor see nor walk nor talk. These lifeless idols, the people still worship them. Why? Because they are deceived by them. These false prophets has deceived them. Their own desires have deceived them into believing that these idols, these things which they chase after, can fulfill all their hopes and dreams. But it's mirage. These idols are deaf, they're dumb, they cannot do anything for the people, but they are deceived into thinking they can by their own desires, which drives them to pursue them at all costs. Now, we're also told about this mark of the beast. What do we make of that? Well, there's a couple of suggestions that people put forward, and one I might mention first is this idea of 666. What does that mean? Well, some people have argued that we've got 7 trumpets in the book of Revelation, 7 seals, we're about to see 7 bowls of wrath poured out on the earth. Everything is 7. And I have mentioned before that 7's an important number because 7 represents completeness. It represents the 7 spheres of heaven, and that's what John is trying to make his way through in this prophecy. So some people think that if the person receives the mark of the beast, it's a number of a man, it's a number of humanity. It's not completion, it's not perfection. It represents kind of there, but almost there. And there's some merit to that. If we look at the 6th seal is open, we see the people of the earth suffering and crying out in their torment because their own violence is being poured back on their own head. We saw a similar thing when the 6th trumpet was blown. We focus in on those people who are committing violence on the earth. So we do see that number 6 come up again and again, representing humanity, if you like, and more importantly, sinful humanity who are caught up, who follow after the beast as distinct from the saints. So that's one explanation that people put forward for the mark of the beast and what it means, but I'm less convinced. I think it's more to do with a puzzle, because John says in his own prophecy, he says, let them calculate the mark of the beast because it's the number of a man or a human. So you could read that rather than saying it's the number of humanity, as I said in the first interpretation, it's the number of a specific human. And it's not that crazy because there's this practice called gematria in the ancient world. Gematria is the practice of taking the individual letters in a name or a word and adding them together to give you a numerical value. Now, each letter in this scheme would have its own value, like A might equal 1, B 2, C 3, etc., etc. And if you added them all up, all the letters in a name, for example, you would get a particular numeric value. And in this case, we have the value 666. And different people have offered different solutions to this numerical value throughout history. Even Hitler was described as, or has been argued as, the value 666. But what I find the most compelling is the idea of Nero Kaiser, which is Nero Emperor. And that value adds up to 666. Now, there's also a manuscript difference there, that some manuscripts will say the number is 616, which changes things up a little and throws another spanner in the works, adding another difficulty to the whole interpretation of the thing. But I think this is probably the most solid interpretation. The number of the beast is Nero Kaiser. And I've argued throughout this series that the first beast represents empire, and to these people who were suffering, Nero was that emperor who called people to die and give their lives so that he could become rich, powerful, famous, all those things. There's also stories of Nero being particularly cruel to Christians, setting them alight at like human candles in his garden, things like that, distressing, suffering, and persecution. at the hands of this particular emperor. Now, at the time of writing the book of Revelation, Nero was dead. Nero had gone. But there was the idea that Nero would come back to life. That they called it the Nero Redivivus myth. The idea, this rumor that was spread that Nero would come back to life and resume his power on the throne. And if you remember, the beast that arose out of the water had a wound that had been healed. This might be a reference to this Nero Redivivus myth. This idea that Nero had been killed, had been slain, but had somehow come back to life. Which again is mirroring the Lamb, who had a mortal wound, but had come back to life to resume his power and his authority on the throne. So what do we take from this? What does the number of 666 mean? Well, I think, as I mentioned in an earlier episode, it points us again to this idea of an emperor, a power who is inspired by the devil, by Satan, by the ancient water chaos dragon to sow violence and destruction in the earth. And this, through the help of this Antichrist figure, this second beast that comes from the land, he inspires all the people to follow after him and do his bidding. We are told that the people can't buy or sell unless they have the mark. Well, there's a whole buy or sell idea in the ancient world. People had to be part of trade guilds, and eating in the markets, there would be food sacrificed to idols. And if you didn't want to partake in that sort of idolatry, if you like, then you couldn't eat the meat. And there's this whole discussion in the New Testament, particularly in the Pauline corpus, about whether people can actually eat food sacrificed to idols. Is it immoral for Christians to do so, or can they? And there's different answers given depending on who you ask. So this whole idea that you couldn't buy or sell unless you had the mark, it's an idea of you can't participate in the ancient Roman world unless you participate in this idolatry, at least to some extent, unless you buy in to this whole scheme, to this emperor cult, to this emperor worship and all the gods of ancient Rome. Unless you get involved with that and participate in that, you were set apart from the rest of the society. And I do think that's what's going on here. This mark of 666 is an allegiance to the emperor and the cult of the emperor, but also the cult of other gods, which were all a big part of Roman society at the time. If the Christians weren't going to participate in that, they couldn't participate in society. It wasn't like the world we live in, where we have this secular world where you can go to Woolies and you can just buy food and it's a secular exercise. The spiritual, the religious was intertwined and woven into every single aspect of their society. And so that's why these people who refuse to follow the beast, who refuse to receive his mark, cannot participate. They receive their mark on their forehead and on their hand. Why? Because their forehead is what they believe. It's their allegiance. It's who they follow. And their hand, because it's also the way that they act. So the mark of the beast, the 666, represents a total allegiance to the emperor, a total allegiance to the cult of the emperor, both in the way you think and in the way you act. The things that you do with your right hand is a way of saying, how do you act? Both in thought, word, and deed, these people are committed to the beast and his program. So if you enjoyed this, you found this analysis helpful, then don't forget to give me a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.